dropped, and it's showtime from downtown Winnipeg.
See the blast. Moves back. Scores! Shifley wires it. Scores!
What a stop by Hellebuck!
Kyle Connor. Jets go bang, bang, bang!
Welcome to Ground Control, the official podcast of the Winnipeg Jets.
It's episode 161 of the Ground Control podcast, the season recap edition. And before I really dive into things, of course, this is Mitchell Clinton joined alongside 680 CJOB's Paul Edmonds and Jamie Thomas, as well as Tyler Esquivel, one of the people that brought so much of the behind-the-scenes content this season. I do have one question for everyone. You know, usually these episodes, they're recorded at the downtown office in the audio suite, which is where Jamie's hanging out currently, making us all look bad. But I was going to say, you know, do we, the other three of us now, are we recording from satellite offices? Does that make it sound like we have a network of recording studios? Because that's what I think I'm going to call it.
There's a big tax write-off coming up next year for that one day you spent at home in your home office. Yeah.
All right,
so.
Good. Yeah, that's what I'm going to go with. So,
Yeah.
Nonetheless, here we are breaking down the 2022-23 season for the Winnipeg Jets, which ultimately came to an end in 5 games to the Vegas Golden Knights. It's a tough series to really look back on, whether that be for injury reasons, the fact it started so well with the Game 1 win, the furious comeback in Game 3, or otherwise. But when I ask you guys your feelings on that series, what comes to mind? And Paul, as the play-by-play voice, let's go with you first.
I have said this before, and it begs repeating. I worry about what happens to teams when they lose in overtime or double overtime. And you expend all that energy in Game 3 to come back from a 3-goal deficit in the third period, and you just can't find your way to scoring that game-winning goal. And yes, Pierre-Luc Dubois came awful close, ringing one off the pipe. But then when you have expended that energy and you don't get the result that you want and the euphoria goes up and then boom, it just pops like a bubble, I worry about the latent effect of the rest of the series because I've seen it before in other sports, but principally it's the same thing. And yeah, they had a valiant fight in Game 4 to try to respond again, try to tie. But boy, if they would have won that game 3, that first game at home, the city would have been on fire for sure. You're up 2-1 in the series. You're probably getting for sure a Game 6 if you don't go on to maybe kind of use that as momentum to yourself and to your propulsion of winning the series. And we're probably talking about a bit of a different narrative. So for me, yes, the loss of Josh Morrissey, the loss of Mark Scheifele in the series, and only getting Nikolai Ehlers back for Game 5, that certainly hurts. I mean, as I've had conversations with Jamie and some other people about this as we've kind of done the postmortem on it, hey, take Chandler Stevenson, Mark Stone, and Alex Pietrangelo out of their lineup, and let's see how Vegas would perform. It would be completely different. In saying that, that's what it was for the Jets. They battled adversity and injuries all year, so we're not kind of surprised that they had to do that again in the postseason. But for me, a different result in that double overtime game might have evoked a different result in what happened in the series.
And for me too, Mitch, I think because of the way the series ended, a lot of people forgot about what the rest of the series was like, how close it was. And outside of Game 2, the last, half, from the second period on in game number 2, the Jets were the better team in this series for 4 periods, then starting in Vegas, and then you lose Game 3. But the way it ended really got people or had people forgetting about how close it all was, what it looked like, the momentum, how the city was starting to really come around this team, especially that last homestand for the playoffs. So there's a lot of good things built into this. So, I mean, the unfortunate way Game 5 happened, everyone forgot about how good the series was before that, how close it was, and how evenly played for the majority part of the series. So it's unfortunate the way it ended, but it was the Jets had their chance, and as Paul talked about, we would be talking about a much different narrative had they won game number 3, and the momentum that would have came from that probably would have helped this series along.
All right. Nonetheless, well, now obviously everything starts to look toward the summer, and we'll get to what kind of decisions Kevin Cheveldayoff has ahead of him when it comes to the summer in just a second. But as we complete our recap of what the season looks like from all three of you, I'm curious if there's a game or a moment that stood out, because I look back to the start of the season, Jamie, Paul, and I, we sat here and we were going through the 5 games we'd really want to have a ticket to. And as a way to kind of look back, I'm curious if either of you guys have a particular game or a particular moment in the season that really stood out. And Tyler, you've been sitting there, you get to go first.
Yeah, for me, I was thinking about it a bit this morning as you had sent a nice crafted email detailing what we're going to discuss. So I had some time while watching Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. That's kind of my off-season job number one. I think for me, it was, it's no secret the Winnipeg Jets came out of the gates on fire, really surprised a lot of the hockey world in terms of just how they were playing, given the narratives that were heading into the season. New coach, Rick Bowness. I think just the start of the season was really exciting, but for me, the things that stood out were the 2 overtime winners by Josh Morrissey against the Carolina Hurricanes, and then 2 games later against the Dallas Stars. Just, it was a kind of a coming out party for the kid. Obviously, we all know what he's capable of, but for him to take the stage like that and score those 2 OT winners, there was a great moment after the game in Dallas too. Rick Bowness is coming off the ice and kind of just fist bumps like, wow, that kid can skate. It's in the Runway episode. That was my sort of favorite moment, if you will, from the season.
I'll go next on that one. I think there, like Tyler said, there's a lot of great moments. The start was tremendous. The fact they're hanging around first place in the Western Conference right before the All-Star break. Part is that last homestand where the criticism came after the 3-0 loss to San Jose and that California road trip, and everything was falling apart, and you're wondering if they're going to be able to piece it together and hold on long enough to make the playoffs. And then that homestand comes, and they win 4 or 5, and in some of those games in dominant fashion. You're seeing everything that the Winnipeg Jets were earlier in the year, all that talent, the penalty kill, the power play. They really nailed it together in a big win over top of New Jersey, who's no team to sneeze at. And then, that game on Saturday night when the pressure's on, they beat Nashville 2-0, close it out against a team that, tortured them all year long in the San Jose Sharks. And then last but not least, that win in Minnesota, where I thought that the momentum they built on and the way the team came together, so, supporting one another, having each other's backs when things got really physical with the Minnesota Wild in the clinching game to get in the playoffs, I thought that was going to be the springboard for the postseason. But that last homestand, that game in Minnesota, that was my favorite part of the season because of all the things that were on their backs and all the criticism that was coming to them and all the pressure they were under. The Jets delivered when they had to, won 4 games out of 5 in their final homestand. Of course, that game in Minnesota or St. Paul to clinch a playoff spot. So that was, to me, all the great things that happened earlier in the year to close out the regular season the way they did was
I
fantastic.
think you stole my notes. So, all of the things leading up, and I'm going to go with Tyler here, that one overtime game in Dallas was a bit of a highlight. I've got a couple here, and I think that, it comes from an honest place. I mean, the way Josh Morrissey scored that overtime winner in the breakaway speed that he had against Jason Robertson. So, Robertson's a little younger and he's a little taller and he's got a longer stride, and yet Josh Morrissey broke away from him to score that goal. That was a highlight for me. And that was a big moment, I think, for the Jets in flipping the script, especially against the Dallas Stars, because they did ultimately win that season series against the Stars. Not that it really accounted for anything later in the season, but it was good to know that against one of the top performers in your division, you had the season series in case it did have a bit of a count back aspect. Then I'm with JT, but for a different reason. That homestand, the building was electric again. It reminded me of pre-COVID. There was 5 games there, and yeah, there was a bit of a slip against Calgary. I understand all of that. But overall, everybody was electrified in watching this team pursue a playoff spot. And you would love to have a Boston Bruins type regular season team because you're going to go almost on a nightly basis down to the rink and watch your team win and outperform the others. But that time of year when you are also chasing for a playoff spot, if you're that team, that can be exciting. and exhilarating for your market and your fan base. And that's what we saw. And within that game, we saw Mark Scheifele for the first time score 40 goals. He had banged on the door before. Like, he had never gotten through that threshold. He had been there a couple of times, and he scores his 40th. It ends up being the game winner, the first time to 40 in a 2-0 shutout victory over the Nashville Predators during that homestand. And then I'm also with Jamie. Game 81 for me was my favorite. At a time of need, the Winnipeg Jets needed to perform to their ultimate best to win a hockey game, because going into Colorado in game 82 and hoping you get a point or two was a daunting task. The best opportunity that you had was right in that moment in game 81 to grab a point or two, and ultimately you grabbed two against Minnesota, your arch rivals, in a game that got off the rails for sure, was out of control at points, but you also beat them. You also stood up for yourselves. You rallied around it. And for the first time in the season series, you beat your foe because you had to. And there's just something remarkable about, in that moment, having to, defeat somebody that you didn't have a very good track record against in order for you to get into the playoffs. So that was my favorite game, was game 81, and that 3-1 victory against the Minnesota Wild in St. Paul, no question.
So I've got two moments. I don't know, like, particular game. I'm not really sure. I mean, I enjoyed the ones where Winnipeg played like super well, especially on the road, like the win in Pittsburgh, where it was just a complete and dominant effort there. But in terms of moments, and it sucks because the way that sometimes a media job works is, as the game's coming down to the final minutes or whatever, you got to run downstairs to be able to go into the room for post-game availability. And that was the case in game 3 against Vegas. So when Adam Lowry scores the tying goal, I'm actually underneath the stands, kind of right by the Matt Frost Media Center, and just so we can get to the room quickly and all that kind of stuff. And he scores, and I'll never forget that building absolutely like blowing up to make it 4-4. So that moment I'm going to remember for a while. And then also, of course, a lot of the ones that you guys mentioned, but I'm surprised. And Tyler, you touched on Josh Morrissey and his coming out party, but the goal he scored against St. Louis and the celebration against the glass, getting the fans all riled up, that one for sure is going to stand out to me. I'll watch that highlight clip over and over again, just because, I mean, that Winnipeg comes back and wins that game. That's, one reason to make it an easy YouTube watch, but also just the fact that really seemed to be one of the moments in the season where, adversity was hitting the Jets, and Josh Morrissey was one of the big reasons why they were able to pull out of it. Tyler, you touched on Runway just a little bit. That was a project took up a significant chunk of your time this year, and that as well as obviously Caleb Snyder and Sarah Lesky had a big role in that as well. Lots of great episodes this year, and a lot of behind the scenes stuff, whether that was, Nino Niederreiter arriving in Winnipeg and his first day at the rink, or post-game speeches. I'm just curious if there's anything that stood out to you from that project overall.
Yeah, I mean, it was an exciting project to be able to bring Jets fans a little bit behind the scenes. I will say too, like, I hope this project continues and hope people enjoyed it enough to want it to continue. But yeah, like, so many great little storylines over the course of the year, from, Sam Gagner playing in his 1,000th NHL game, which I think pretty cool, considering like he has had a heck of a career, and who knows if it's over. Like, there still could be more to that story. But really cool to be a part of that. Caleb Snyder did a fantastic job with that episode. He cut that one. Rick Bonus's return to Dallas. Dylan Sandberg playing in his home state for the first time. There were a lot of really cool storylines that we were able to touch on. Players were really generous with their time in terms of just giving us access to their lives and inside the dressing room as well. But just, throughout a hockey season, it's wash, rinse, repeat a lot of it. You get to the rink for morning skate, then you have your afternoon, and then you go to the game and you hope for a win. Some of my favorite moments were just being in the locker rooms after the wins. It's just, the guys work so hard to be able to earn those victories, and to see it all pay off, even just on a nightly basis in the regular season, And it doesn't matter whether it's in October or April. Like they're still just as jazzed up. And obviously the ones later on in the season, they were a lot more exciting because they were pushing for a playoff spot. But those were my favorite moments to do. I do have one quick story to do with Runway that I think you guys will enjoy. The episode in depth with bonus was myself and Adam Kruger, our content lead. He was subbing in for Caleb that road trip, and part of that episode, if you will recall, was Bones doing his pregame speech ahead of the game. Now, some backstory into that: the team had come off a pretty bad loss in Minnesota on Thanksgiving. I scheduled us in Minnesota on Thanksgiving next year. I'm sure you guys would agree. So we won't get into that too much. But anyway, so he was going to wear a mic that morning, but I think the sentiment was just like, maybe we don't do that for the morning skate in Dallas, just because I'm thinking he probably had some conversations to have with people. And I think there were some lineup changes too. So the agreement was we would do the pregame speech. But for those, to give you a sense of what that room in Dallas looks like, the visiting room, you kind of walk in, and it's a very shallow room, and there's more stalls to the right than there are on the left. But the left is where like the goalies sit, and maybe like I think Perfetti was sitting over there. It's kind of like a bit of an isolated area. There's really not a whole lot going on, but the whiteboard's over there. And in order for me to capture, excuse me, what we needed to capture, get Rick's face on camera, so I couldn't stand at the doorway, but directly across from the doorway, across from the room, is the bathroom. Now, I couldn't necessarily like walk through the room after Rick walked in, so I had to get in there first. But so our PR director told me, he's like, okay, so you're good to go in the room, but you got to go stand in the bathroom. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I got to stand in the bathroom. He's like, well, he explained it, what I just explained. I'm like, okay, well, when do I got to go in the bathroom? Well, he's like, well, on the countdown clock, coach usually does a speech at about the 8-minute mark before the game starts. He's like, you got to go. And I think he was just kind of toying with me at this point, but I did it anyway. So I went into the bathroom like 7 minutes before Bones goes and does a speech. And I'm like ready to go. And like, I've been around the team long enough. Like the guys all know me and they're comfortable around me. But at the same time, like I'm just the dude in the bathroom with the camera. So I was getting absolutely torched by the guys. Like, what are you doing over there? Like, the bathroom camera and blah, blah, blah. So I stood there for 7 painful minutes in the doorway of the bathroom as guys walked by me to go, relieve themselves or wet their hair. And then finally Rick came in, what felt like the longest 7 minutes of my life. He gave a great speech and I exited, and I left my dignity back in that bathroom in Dallas. So the sacrifices we all make to share great moments with the fans.
For a
so
15-second clip.
Yep.
For a 15-second clip, which, hey, it was nice. Good. The bathroom didn't smell terrible, so that's good. But yeah, so that's my Runway story. I hope to bring I know there's been a lot of conversations and the season just ended, but we're really excited to hopefully do this next year and bring more great storylines and great moments to the Jets fans. So that's my Runway story.
Shows my producer chops. I should have just ended on that real positive story, because now I've got to go into everything that has to go on in the summer and all those serious decisions and everything. But there's no easy way to transition into that. But obviously, there's the NHL draft, June 28th, 29th. Of course, we'll have everything about that event covered. Free agency and beyond all that, there's contract negotiations, potential arbitration dates. It's all stuff that every team really has to deal with. Jets have 5 RFAs, all with arb rights, that being Dubois, Barron, Stenlund, Sandberg, Stanley. Of course, getting all this from Cap Friendly. On top of that, there's 6 UFAs: Vladislav Nemesnikov, Carson Kuhlman, Axel Jonsson-Fjällby, Saku Manalainen, Sam Gagner, and David Riddick. That's a busy offseason for Kevin Cheveldayoff, with the summer of 2024 also looking busy. Paul, Jamie, anybody that wants to take it, near impossible to predict, but what does the summer hold outside of a very busy calendar for Kevin Cheveldayoff?
Of that list of UFAs, I would love to see them bring back Sacramento line just based on what I saw this year. And I thought Menelina was a key part to a penalty kill that was amongst the NHL's best. I love the fact that he likes to play the game physically, does not back down. Great fourth line player. So of that group there, that's the guy I'd like to see them bring back the most. The other part is now you also have guys on their last year of their contracts in Mark Scheifele, Blake Wheeler, Connor Hellebuck. I know Brendan Dillon's only got 1 year left on his deal. So to me, the question mark is, are all four of those guys come back, and what does that look like if they do? So I think Kevin Cheveldayoff's got a very interesting summer in front of him, and that's what I always like with Kevin Cheveldayoff to come and talk to the media 2 days after the season ended. There's like so many things that have to come into place, and I find it's very hard for him to answer all the questions that are coming at him when they're just in the initial stages of the off season. So to me, this looks, and I've said this a lot. It's only my 6th year here. I haven't been here since the beginning, since the Jets came back. But to me, this is the most interesting offseason in the history of Jets 2.0 history as we embark upon it. But very interesting summer indeed coming up for this hockey club.
Well, I predicted there's going to be some changes here and probably some of the seismic variety. I don't know what those are, but you can rest assured that there is a plan here, okay? And the funny thing about plans is that you have a great plan and then something happens, therefore you have to deviate from the plan, right? So they could say, well, we're going to bring this group back. We're going to try to sign this guy. And then all of a sudden something happens, or you get a trade offer or something that you can't refuse, or somebody says that they'd like to go somewhere else. There's all kinds of things that are orbiting around. And you're right. I mean, Kevin has a bit of a difficult time answering some of those questions specifically 48 hours after the season concludes, because they don't know what's going to happen with player X. And that's maybe where the starting point is. But I'll tell you where the starting point is. The starting point for me needs to be in two directions. Number one, Connor Hellebuck, because without a top-notch goaltender, I don't know where you go moving forward. The other part of that is, too, if Connor Hellebuck is not re-signed here after the 1 year that he still has remaining on his deal, then who assumes that spot? You're probably looking at maybe going out in the free agent market, because I don't know that there's anybody within the system right now that can become the number one goaltender as quickly as you need them to become if Connor Hellebuck departs the organization, right? So that's a starting point for me. The other one is Pierre-Luc Dubois. Do you want to be here long-term? Do you want to sign long-term? What is your plans? I mean, maybe force the issue if on his camp side. I'm not so sure, guys, that really the Montreal thing for him is all in. I think that, he'd like to see what kind of money he could get here, what the team's direction is, and then he'll decide from there. If it's decided on his end that he does not want to be part of this, and for the record, there hasn't been many that have decided that. Jacob Trouba was one of them, and maybe Pierre-Luc Dubois, but we don't know. But it's their prerogative. I mean, that's what they've earned to get to unrestricted free agency from that standpoint, or being a restricted free agent with some sort of arb rights and some negotiation, tactics and strongholds. So those are the two for me. Everything else will place after that, right? Do you have more money then to sign Mark Scheifele? Do you have the opportunity to then bring a couple of more free agents in? There's all kinds of things that are still uncertain here, but the starting point has to be, I think, for your goaltender and what's your plan, long-term, short-term, and what's happening with Pierre-Luc Dubois. And I think everything kind of gets filled in from there afterward. Yes, Mark Scheifele's a priority for sure. I mean, till this year, I think 6 years in a row, a point per game player. He is a big part of the Winnipeg Jets and has been for a number of years. And he's basically a charter member. I mean, he didn't play that many games in the first 2 years because he was still a teenager, but he did have some influence on what was coming back in those 2011, 2012 seasons and 2012, 2013. So again, there's questions about him, but the starting point for me is Connor Hellebuck, and move off from there. And a real close second or a 1A would be Luke Dubois and what his intentions are in terms of another contract going forward. So a lot of questions, a lot of work to be done. You know, it's interesting. We always think about the summer as sort of put your feet up, get a line in the water, and away you go. Well, not for NHL general managers, and certainly not for the administrative staff and the executive of the Winnipeg Jets this year. There's a lot going on, the draft, free agency, and all of these guys that are either UFA or RFA that you have to kind of look at and consider into your plans going forward. And then also, are you making some room, I guess my last point, for some of the guys that deserve to be bumped up at some point from the Manitoba Moose, like a Declan Chisholm, a Leon Gavanka, the list goes on, and even Jansen Harkins, who had a heck of a year after being sent down to the minors with the Manitoba Moose and is still involved in the playoffs. And Game 3 goes tonight in Milwaukee between the Moose and the Admirals, by the way, and that series is tied at 1. So a lot of things orbiting around, a lot of questions. I think we'll ascertain some answers as the days, weeks, and months go along in the offseason.
And as those days, weeks, and months go along, winnipegjets.com is the place to go for all the content and news related to that. Yes, and it's a good point, Paul. A big shout out to the Manitoba Moose as they continue their series against the Milwaukee Admirals, looking for some revenge from last season when the two teams met. An incredible overtime game in game number 2 led to the split in Winnipeg. And then, of course, the next 3 games in the best of 5 are all in Milwaukee. So make sure you stay up to date with the Manitoba Moose as well as they try to get some playoff success as well. Gentlemen, want to thank all of you for a sensational year on the Ground Control podcast, and also, of course, on 680 CJOB, and Tyler, of course, behind the scenes for all your great work on the content that appears on winnipegjets.com and the social media channels as well. And of course, a huge thanks to the listener. We will continue to bring all the news that we can as the summer goes on. As Paul Edmonds kind of alluded to, it's going to be an interesting summer, and one that you're not going to want to miss any of the news that comes out of the Winnipeg Jets offices in downtown Winnipeg. Gentlemen, thank you. Listeners, thank you. And the next episode of Ground Control will come along when there's lots to discuss.
This has been Ground Control, the official podcast of the Winnipeg Jets. For more Jets news, videos, and more, head to winnipegjets.com.